The book table will be there at the break, so you can tear yourselves away. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural event of the 10th year of the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience. It promises to be a very rich year, and in case you haven't received brochures, there are several out at the back that will give you the details about the coming year. It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce the speakers for this evening, Rosmary Houghton and Nancy Schwoyer. Both live and work in a community called Wellspring House in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And in conversation with them this evening, I managed to put flesh on the whole idea of what Wellspring House is. I also discovered that if you go to Gloucester, Massachusetts and want to find your way to Wellspring House, the thing to do is go to the local police station, because they're used to directing people to Wellspring House, and they'll tell you exactly how to get there. Wellspring responds to the needs of the homeless poor in a variety of ways around Gloucester, as well as having many spin-offs in the fields of education and housing. Rosemary has authored several books. In fact, I was looking at the description in our brochure, and it seems to be a list of numbers. She has authored several books, has 6 honorary degrees, 1 Doctor of Divinity, 10 children, and several foster children. And I'm sure the list of numbers could go on and on. One of her books, her most recent, is available at the back. It's called Song in a Strange Land, and it describes the Wellspring story. And I just glanced at it this evening, and it sounds very interesting. Nancy has been actively involved in the civil rights and peace movement in the States, as well as parish religious education at all levels. Their topic tonight with us is prophetic spirituality, and I think it's a very appropriate topic to begin with because St. Jerome Centre tries to bring together the social justice dimension and the spiritual dimension of our current Christian experience. I know that it will be a moving and profoundly important spiritual event for you this evening. We'll follow our usual format, a presentation and then a break and then returning here for discussion. I have great pleasure in introducing to you Nancy and Rosemary, and would ask you to invite them to St. Jerome's.
As several people have pointed out, the pictures were the wrong way around. I'm Rosemary, and this is Nancy. And we're going to talk about the subject for this evening from different points of view. And I'm the one who's going to begin. We do this quite a lot. We kind of bounce off each other, both in preparation and when we're presenting, and we find that this sort of team approach gives us both ideas we wouldn't have developed otherwise. So, one of us says something to the other, and she says, "Oh, well, how about so-and-so?" And no, I don't quite think that's going to fit, and so it grows. And the subject this evening is one that's become extremely important to us as a subject because it became important to us as an experience. When I say us, in this case, I mean not just Nancy and myself, but other people, men and women, who have become part of the Wellspring House experience. Wellspring House does a lot of different things, but at the heart of it is a shelter for homeless families. And Nancy and I live in the house, in the same house where the families live, and there are a number of other people involved. And over the years, we've been going for 10 years. We celebrated our 10th anniversary with tremendous excitement and events this year. Over the years, a number of people have shared this experience. And we started not very clear about what it was that we were doing. We started with the idea of hospitality, a group of people who had tried to serve those in need and to serve the cause of justice in their lives in a number of different ways, but felt that they could do it much more effectively if they did it together. So it was as vague as that to begin with. And we pooled resources which didn't amount to much and got loans from here and there and started. And as time went on and we began to realize the implications of living day after day with people in such need, it was a real challenge to us as Christians to think about how we could do that. the kind of people who come to our house, homeless families, almost all of them actually are single-parent families headed by women. We do have intact families as well. They're all people carrying a long personal history of suffering, quite apart from the trauma of homelessness. What has led up to their homelessness and what went on for years before that is part of the story. And it isn't only one person's story, it's the story of generations very often. Whether it's generations of poverty or whether it's generations of middle-class people with the kind of values that push their children out, there's a long history. Women escaping from abuse, women with a history of incest, and an astonishingly high proportion do. Children who've been through all that implies of being pushed from one house to another, trying one relationship after another, dragged along in the tail of adult failure. And then you try and help these people to find a way to, first of all and primarily, to find somewhere to live, which is their own place, but also to begin to put the bits of their lives together and realize just how difficult that is. And doing that involves dealing with what one calls the system, in other words, the welfare system, the social services, the government, the housing, all those bits and pieces that come into the lives of poor people. And beyond that, the system with a larger sort of capital letter, meaning just how our society organizes itself in relation to people in need. And you begin to recognize a system of built-in injustice, which begins to look less and less accidental as you go on. And people's lives being crushed. And so you've got the two sides. You've got the personal need of the people you're dealing with all the time, and you've got that system out there which is crushing these people. How do you make sense of living a ministry of that kind? How do you go on hoping? You'll feel a lot of anger. What do you do with that anger? The anger is important and it's right, but it's not enough to be angry. So where do you go with that? And over the years, meeting together weekly and at other times for prayer and for studying the Gospels, we got in touch with the concept which in the end, and after a long time, we began to call prophetic spirituality. The idea behind that phrase, and it wasn't called that for a long time, you feel towards it and then eventually you give it a name, but it took a while to develop. Of course, it's a biblical concept. And one of the things that we became aware of was the way in which, in the history of the people of Israel, the prophets spoke out of the kind of awareness and the kind of anger that we were experiencing. Of what happens when it becomes clear that people who have claimed to be God's people, or as in our case, claimed to be, in some sense or other, religious people, Christian people, when the system shows that it's nothing of the kind, that the values that inform legislation, decision-making, career-making, whatever, tend to have very little to do with the values which are sort of written up as banners. The prophets of Israel reacted against that by calling people to recognize what had gone wrong. And it's when things are clearly wrong that people, ordinary people, begin to listen for something else. When the slogans and the media and the stuff that administrations try to make people believe, all the patriotism and all that stuff, begins to sound a little hollow in the face of the kind of experience that you're having with people, all kinds of people, but especially people in need. And when you recognize that people in need are so much the focus of God's care, both in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets and, of course, most of all in the life of Jesus, and you recognize there's a huge gap and there's something wrong, you need something else. And you begin to listen for something else, as people did listen, some people, to the prophets of Israel. And that was where we began exploring what that could mean for us. Recognizing that fear and insecurity make people want something different. At times when at least most people feel relatively prosperous and secure, prophetic voices are not heard very much. It's people who recognize there's something wrong who begin to listen for another voice. There's a real longing in all of us for security, for certainty, for a sense that we can get on with our lives, knowing that what we do will be productive, will be worthwhile. And when that's threatened, when all kinds of things happen, as happens so much at the moment, to make people afraid of the future, when there's more unemployment, when people's incomes are going down, when in all sorts of ways our whole society, our whole culture feels threatened, then we want something to believe in, something to comfort us. And there are two kinds of comfort that are offered, and the word comfort takes a little bit different meaning in each context. The false prophets, as Jeremiah called them, and as all the prophets, the great prophets of Israel denounced them, false prophets offer what people want to hear. They tell them that everything is okay, that they're good, that God is going to look after them, and that if things are wrong, it's because other people are wicked. And that is a very comforting kind of thing to believe, and it's very popular at the moment. And there are the type of fundamentalist sects which are very attractive to many people, and which occur within as well as outside the main denominations, and also in other religions, are very attractive because they assure people that they are right with God. And if only they will do what this particular group tells them is right, then they will be okay and everyone else will be punished. It's a promise that is very easy to listen to in some ways. It's a comfort which makes people feel good. Real, true prophets in the models of the prophets of Israel do something very different. They call people to be aware, to allow themselves to be aware of what is wrong, first of all. That's the first step before anything else can happen. They say something has gone wrong. The wrongness is within the people itself. It's not some other group out there who can be your scapegoat for what's happened. It's within us. We have lost touch with God's revelation. We've lost touch with the covenant. Therefore, what we have to do as a people is to repent and try to do something differently. It's no good blaming the others. If there are others who are our enemies, the real problem lies with ourselves. And in Jeremiah, we have him denouncing the false prophets who tell everybody, peace, peace, when there is no peace. The kind of peace that is made on the backs of the poor, the kind of peace that is made on the bodies of hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East. But the prophet also announces a different possibility. The prophet calls people to live by a new vision. And so the real prophet offers comfort, but it's a different kind of comfort. It's the strength, the comfort in the sense of strength. The strength that comes from understanding that something else is possible. And Moses did it, not offering people the sense that everything was going to be fine, but offering them the possibility of freedom, which was going to be very difficult. In the time of the exile, with the people coming back from exile in Babylon, second Isaiah was offering people a vision of possibility, but out of a very difficult time, something to reach for. And Jesus, in his turn, standing in the great heritage of the prophets of Israel, created a prophetic community. He was indeed the prophet, much more than that, but certainly a prophet. But from our point of view, the most important thing that he did among us, created, through his life, through his death, through his resurrection, he created a prophetic community. And that is what the church is meant to be. And the point was that even during his lifetime on earth, the little community that was gathered around him was just as important for what it was, for what people saw when they looked at it, as for the way he described it. He taught people to live in a way that made them, in a sense, prophetic just by being there. And this has become part of the whole experience of the history of Christianity in its many, many strands. Throughout the history of Christianity, two things have gone on. One is in every case, a necessary institutionalization, which has very often led to a rigidity and a desire to preserve the institution for its own sake. On the other hand, throughout the history of Christianity, there's been a constant series of eruptions, if you might call it, of people who caught once more the prophetic message which was carried through the centuries and lived it. And they were often persecuted, not only by other people outside the church, but by the church itself. But they represent the vitality of the gospel which is carried in the tradition and which sort of bubbles up every now and then. This is a history of people choosing to live by the vision which was proclaimed by the prophets and by Jesus, a vision of something new. And there are many examples. I suppose one of the most famous, for instance, is the Franciscan Revolution, as it's been called. A sudden rediscovery of the prophetic vision of people caring and sharing, letting go greed, letting go ambition, and serving each other. It was something that spread like wildfire through Europe, with people of all kinds, rich people, poor people, suddenly recognizing that life with that vision could mean something very different from what they had been taught to expect. In a different sort of context, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, were an extraordinary eruption of prophetic vision, a vision of people who greeted each other as friends, with whom there were no class distinctions, no distinctions between the sexes, in which people accepted each other simply as people in whom God dwelt. And therefore they could address each other in that knowledge and could experience the Spirit in that way. It was an extremely powerful thing that lasted through the centuries. In another sort of way, in the Catholic tradition and in the Episcopal tradition, there have been the emergence of small religious communities all through the centuries. Many of them women's communities. They usually began by a group of people wanting to live a life that was in touch with the prophetic vision of Jesus. And usually also after a time they've been sort of brought into line and institutionalized in their turn. But there's something that keeps on happening. People keep on catching the message. And by doing that, somehow bringing new life to the tradition, which is so easily becomes rigid and lifeless. In this century, out of many examples I can think of, I'm reminded of my own experience of the young Christian workers in the years after World War II, when I was a student. The Jossistes, they began in France. And the enthusiasm and the sense of hopefulness, of the possibility of coming together to create a new world out of the disaster that was post-war Europe. There was again that tremendous sense of vision of something that could make a different kind of world. Now, in all of these cases, and all of many others I'm sure you can think of, it was the way of life that people saw which was primarily the prophetic voice. It was how these people lived that mattered. Oh, certainly what they said was important, what they said to each other, their way of praying together, their way of studying scripture, their way of constantly interpreting their lives in the light of the vision of the gospel. But what people saw from outside was what really made a difference, what really was the prophetic voice. The way they treated each other, the way they listened to each other, the way they seemed to be with God. Those were the things that made a difference in all of those cases that I've mentioned. And by their existence, not necessarily by anything they said, they were a challenge to the status quo, the religious and the secular, and that's why very often they were persecuted or suppressed in one way or another, either by outright persecution or by sort of suppressing them until they were more or less invisible. But they've never, even though individual groups have disappeared, the thing itself keeps on coming back. And this was what we really began to discover at Wellspring, that in our very small and stumbling way, we were part of that we could take hold of that vision, and that would be the source of our spirituality. It was the choice of living in such a way that one accepted that one was a challenge, that being the way we were was a challenge, and we had to live with that. And it was also a promise. It was a way of being with each other and with people which made sense to us and which we could begin to work out of. As a prophetic spirituality is people living by a different kind of spirit. Spirituality is, and Nancy's going to talk more about that, but spirituality is simply how you live. It isn't a separate sort of something you do on the side in order to sort of spiritualize or Christianize or whatever, the ordinary things you do. It is the ordinary things you do, but it's how you do it and the attitudes you do it with. So to think about prophetic spirituality is to think about a way of life which is rooted in the gospel message and which expresses itself in all aspects of daily life, and therefore is energized to address the needs of our time. I'm going to ask Nancy to talk about the next part. What's the heading you've got for that?
Several headings for that. It was interesting as we came together 10 years ago to live together in community and to live hospitality together, to open our door to whomever came to our door, that at the same time we went to a convention and heard Sandra Schneider from California do a presentation on a new book by Walter Brueggemann, the Lutheran scripture scholar, called Prophetic Imagination. And that book became very important to us because it helped us to have a language by which we could talk to each other about the experience that we were having together. And finding a common language when you come from so many different pasts is a real important thing to do. Maybe the time will come when we won't have to use a phrase like prophetic spirituality. We'll just simply say spirituality. And of course, it will be prophetic. But the reason for needing to use that phrase now, historically, where we stand, is rooted in a historic attitude, and a stance toward life that just goes back centuries and centuries and centuries. And it's an attitude toward life, or an understanding of life, which we now call or have called dualism. It's far too complex to trace the history of that, but we've all lived under it, and we still live under it. It's that kind of understanding of life in which we say very glibly that, of course, there's a difference between, or a division between, the soul and the body. There's a division between spirit and matter. There's a division between heaven and earth. And of course, it's not that those two things are divided. It's that we begin to label one as good and the other as evil. One is better than the other. And even if we're not going to talk about something being good or evil, and particularly evil, we'll say, well, some things are better than the other. For example, in my spiritual journey, a lot of what I had to struggle with, because my bent and my circumstances living in the south of the states in North Carolina during the civil rights movement, I found myself immersed in the movement, and I found myself in the Vietnam resistance. And my spiritual guides were always telling me that I needed to be careful because I was too much of an activist. And I needed to really pay much more attention to the more important part of my life, which was the spiritual part of my life. And I struggled with that for years. And I hear a few chuckles, and maybe we shared the struggle. I think that many of us grew up thinking about spirituality as our personal relationship with God. And Rosemary has already spoken about prophetic spirituality as communitarian. Because prophetic spirituality, indeed the way we live in the world now, is about our relationship with each other and the earth, and finding God and being with God in that discovery, and finding God not outside the world somewhere, not escaping from the mess of this world, but going into the mess of this world and knowing that God is there. A very powerful story for us in the months that we met together and prayed together to decide whether we would do the Wellspring venture was the story early on in Mark's Gospel, after Jesus has cured the man in the temple and goes to Peter's home for the Sabbath meal. And all the people have heard about what's happened in the synagogue, and after sundown and after they can begin traveling because the Sabbath is over, Mark's Gospel tells us they flooded into the streets and they came begging for his help. And he opened the door. He opened the door to all that misery. And he walked into it. And it must have done a job on him too, because the next part of that story is that he went away. He went away to a lonely place, and the disciples came and said, everybody's looking for you. And he said, what we've done here, we've got to do everywhere. We have to move on. So for us, that sense of opening the door and going out and letting in was a very important symbol. Now, that's not to say that each of us does not have our own journey and that we have our own gifts, but that when, in our understanding, in the Wellspring experience, and as we share together with lots of groups of people, our sense is that fundamental to prophetic spirituality is that it is communitarian. It's not the spirituality of select individuals called prophets. And sometimes, in the way, again, that we've read the prophets and been taught the prophets, we see the leaders. And we forget that they were the leaders of communities of people, that they had the ability to talk about the mess of the social reality that they lived in and to announce another kind of way. And it was that stirred the people, and it was that gathered people around them. Now, they're not always popular, right? I mean, there's always those people in power who do not like that message, and we know that. One thing that was very hard for us was to struggle with the fact that there are a lot of people who think one is quite presumptuous when you say you're practicing prophetic spirituality. Attitude is, who the hell do you think you are? Self-claimed prophets? And one has to really struggle with that. And one has to get in touch with the fact that it's a very easy way for people to dismiss something that makes them feel very uncomfortable, and to minimize it. And we do that, unfortunately, with each other all too often. So that this spirituality that we're talking about, we feel that, and for our experience, and certainly it's not our own experience, but it's true for lots of people, as I said, that it's a communitarian journey. It's a communitarian experience. It's rooted in the experience of Jesus, as Rosemary said, who called a prophetic community into being. And indeed, if we read the Gospels carefully, we realize how threatening that group of people became to the establishment. And in line with the Exodus story. And as someone has said, the Exodus story presents a mixed company of people challenging the orthodoxy of their time. Moving from hopeless slave bondage into freedom, with all the mess of that movement, of that journey, with all the mistakes that they made. Nevertheless, at the heart of it, they became a community dedicated to ordering life for the good of all life, under the guidance and love of a just and compassionate God. So, prophetic spirituality is communitarian, we believe, and it's non-dualistic, because it does not separate the activities of the world from the life of the Spirit. The prophetic community interacts with the world, denounces what is destructive to life and out of touch with goodness and peace and justice. And it is quick to recognize and proclaim the presence of God wherever there is justice and peace being lived. Several years ago, on the Feast of the Holy Cross, which is the feast of the Archdiocese of Boston, there was a special Mass said for homeless people, and we were asked to bring homeless people to this Mass. We really had to make it very clear that we were not bringing specimens of humanity to be looked at and to make people feel good. So we invited people, and very few of the guests came, but the staff went. And we didn't stay for the end of that ritual, because the homily went like this. You who are homeless should be very grateful that you are homeless, because it gives you a chance to suffer with Jesus. And those of you who are working with the homeless, yes, it is good that you feed them and that you shelter them. But never forget that that's not the important thing that you're called to do. The important thing that you're called to do is to teach them the Word of God. Don't forget their spiritual life. Well, we went thinking we might get some encouragement for the long haul. And we left feeling estranged from that institution, which we do look to, and I think should be able to look to for support. Thirdly, in terms of kind of characteristics of prophetic spirituality, is that very clearly the God of prophetic spirituality is the God who is free and the one who frees people from all kinds of oppression. There are many sections in Exodus, but in Exodus 3, in verses 7 and 8, there's this just wonderful sentences. Then God said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And really, in those two verses, we have the essence of the prophetic task as Walter Brueggemann gives it to us. For those who know the book, you know that Walter Brueggemann says that the prophet has that the task of prophetic spirituality is really, on the one hand, to denounce what is unjust, and in the other, to announce the possibility of a different kind of future, a different kind of world. And so we have not just this description of what's wrong with Egypt, and we do not have only this description of God hearing that pain and seeing that pain, but we have this sense of a different kind of land. And it's land. It's real. Land is a place where you grow things. And when you grow things and you're out of bondage and it's your land, then you experience the richness of that land, the fullness of that land, the plenty that God always gives. So the first task is to denounce what is unjust. And that calls us in prophetic spirituality to see and to hear what's going on in the world and to struggle to understand it. It's hard work. It is hard work to gain the insight about what's going on in the world and to understand it in such a way that we can dialogue with people who think that they own the world and control the world. And it's everyone. It's not just the professionals. It's not just the experts. Because in the communitarian idea, we all have gifts. It's why I can stand up here, not a professional theologian at all, and be invited by a professional theologian to share a podium with her. Because yes, she's an expert, and I'm a laywoman. But we all have to do theology. And she teaches me to do theology, and I teach her to do other things. And we struggle together to find ways to language this. And it makes it awkward for you. We ask you to come in, and Rosemary starts with the style, and then I get up, and you're kind of like, but that's the nature of community. And Rosemary has lectured and finished, and somebody has walked up to her after she's finished and said, I could sit and listen to your English accent all night. Well, so what? So what? So it is this sense of knowing that to do prophetic spirituality is tough. Leaders of empires do not tolerate denouncement. I don't have to tell you that. And depending on what system we're in and denouncing it, we are labeled as ungrateful, if we're women, unpatriotic, unorthodox, and unrealistic, right? Now, in the denouncement part of our spirituality, the sights and sounds of injustice can rouse us to anger. And as people, we don't do anger real good. We have always seen it as something negative, something to avoid, something to push under the carpet. We've confessed it. But I'll tell you, I still get angry, and I see my sisters and my brothers get angry every time an abused woman comes into our house. And every time I see the state of Massachusetts balancing the budget on the backs of poor people, I get angry. At a recent meeting near us in Gloucester, where some of us who work with homeless people gathered one night to talk to our elected representatives. About 400 people gathered in that room, and we were talking about really basic money being taken away from people who have very little. We were talking about clothes allowance being taken away from children, $150 a year being taken away. We were talking about men under 45 who did not have a work history being taken off all relief rolls, not being able to ever have any kind of relief. We were talking about real tough stuff. And people started to get angry in that room. And we were told by the facilitator of the meeting not to get angry, be patient with our leaders who were doing their best to balance this budget. And I, with other people, said, no, we need to be angry. Don't deny us our anger. In fact, we need to be enraged, because it's the first step of shaking off this terrible numbness that envelops us. If we can shake off the numbness, then maybe we can unleash our imaginations once again to believe that something different is possible. The announcement of a different possibility, a just alternative, requires us to use our memories, to know our histories and our stories and our songs and our traditions. It requires us to see, to look, and to recognize goodness and justice and peace wherever it is, and to name it for what it is and to proclaim it. And that's so in the tradition of the gospel. It's so in the tradition of what Jesus did. Just a few examples. The woman who anointed Jesus' feet was told that was a terrible waste of money. The poor could have been fed with that money. And Jesus said that what she had done would be forever remembered. In fact, wherever the gospel is proclaimed, this woman will be remembered for what she had done. The feeding of the 5,000. The assumption then, as the assumption now, is there's not enough. There's not enough. So we all have to close our hands tighter and fight with each other, because the basic assumption is resources are shrinking. And we know it's a lie. We know it's a lie. We just know that all the plenty is being shared by fewer and fewer people. There's fewer and fewer people claiming all that plenty. But the story of the 5,000 is simply that there is plenty if we can open our hands and share our resources. And Jesus' message and the message of reality, the message of watching the land, is to say, it's not simply that there's enough, there's plenty, but we're called to use it differently. Children. So easy to dismiss. And Jesus says, be like them. Look at them. See what they are. So this seeing things differently and recognizing goodness and justice and truth where it is, and naming that is really essential to our spirituality. This is a time of terrible injustice in which we live. It's a time when I know for myself and lots of folks, That the best I can do is to live somewhere between despair and hope. And I live in hope because I live in community. And because I'm aware of all the things that are going on in this world that are good. Because the other part of this is, it is a terrible time. But it is a time of incredible good news. There is so much being done by small groups of people and large groups of people for the sake of liberation and done by grass movements. So we need memory and we need wisdom to recognize things the way God sees things. And we need imagination to create a different kind of world. Someone has said, whatever we can imagine, we can create. As Rosemary said, when we do prophetic spirituality, we need to do it in action and not only in words. We put the new thing in the middle of the mess. And people look at it. We never had any idea when we started Wellspring House 10 years ago that it would be so attractive to so many people, that it would be a source of hope to so many people. We bought a house in a neighborhood and went on living our lives, holding jobs so that we could share our home with other people. And people are looking for something. They're looking for a different way. I think one of the things is that we need to be sure that we're working for transformation of society and that we're not simply working with poor people and asking them to adapt to an unjust society. And that means you do very different kinds of work. So, in conclusion, I've talked about characteristics and I've talked about the tasks of prophetic spirituality. In conclusion, I'd like to mention some of the virtues, some of the spiritual gifts of living prophetic spirituality. And one is passion. One is it requires us to be people of passion. And that means to have compassion, to live with passion in such a way to do what the word says. It means that our guts literally turn over when we see the pain of other people. I've said that happens to me when I see abused women and children, and when I see the scars and the cigarette burns. And it happened to me last summer when I saw Kurdish women trying to save their babies, going up that mountain, and saw fathers digging graves for those Kurdish children. And it causes us, that part of being passionate people causes us to unleash anger inside us and to have to find ways to deal with that and to be enraged. And if we stay with it, and if we are with people, then inevitably that anger and rage will break into grief. I heard at dinner tonight with Mary and Bridget that Gregory Baum has said this is the time of lamentation. And I think it's a good time for us all to read chapter 9 of Jeremiah, where he calls the women to grief and says, teach your children how to grieve. And I think that our churches and our universities and our places and communities like Wellspring, we need to have places where it's okay to grieve. Because let me tell you, one of the things that the leaders of the empire cannot stand is tears. And one of the things that undoes anybody who wants to be a leader quickly is if he or she should shed tears in public. And we need to be able to shed tears and hold each other and to cry, because it is part of the transforming that we need to give us the energy to stay with this fight, which is a long-haul fight. Jesus raged over the money changers in the temple. He did not very appropriate things when he knocked over the temple. We love to sanitize those stories. But he was mad. And he wept over Jerusalem because it was a missed opportunity. Oh, if you had known the moment. And we need to weep over all that's been lost, and all that we've missed, and all that's being lost for so many people. And we have the comadres, those women in Guatemala and El Salvador, who walk in vigil day after day in the squares in those villages, in memory of their sons and their husbands and their lovers who have disappeared. And the third, if we will be people with passion and compassion and anger and rage and grief. And thirdly, we need to have a lot of endurance. We need to be ready to work hard. And I think that it's, when people say to me, how have you done this work for 10 years? I have to say I have done it because of the community of friends. And I've done it because I'm aware of the incredible amount of networks and other people throughout the world who are doing the same kinds of things. We need ways to keep our memory and our visions alive. We've got to keep the vision alive of what we're doing. We've got to know it's concrete. We've got to build it. We've got to act it, even if it's not perfect. And so we need to tell each other stories. We need to meet each other. And we need to sing songs together and celebrate what it is that we're doing. Our task, I believe, is to be living examples of meaningful alternatives which are in harmony with the tradition of the God of the Exodus and Jesus. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Rosemary is going to wrap us up.
Do you want some water? Thanks.
I want to talk about choices just for a little while to finish up. The kinds of choices that are involved in the sort of thing Nancy's been talking about. We're talking about radical choices. It's interesting how, in a sense, how few real choices we actually make. I don't mean we don't make decisions of all kinds, small and large ones. But we're talking about the kinds of choices that can change people's lives. If we engage with prophetic spirituality in the way Nancy's been talking about it, that means we're making very different kinds of choices. It's possible in times and places where there are very sort of strong and apparently unchanging social expectations not to have to make any very radical choices. I mean, you do the things that are expected, you do the things that are necessary. That's not a bad thing at all. And if you live in a sort of situation where your life unfolds in a good and creative way, and things are fairly clear, you may not have to make any very conscious choices, except the choice to sort of do what's there. But I'm talking about the kinds of choices we have to make sometimes when it means making a break with that, when it really causes you to have to have a look at the things that people expect and that you've expected, and do something different. And the whole of the history of salvation is really about making those kinds of choices. And when we read the story of the Exodus in Scripture, it can sound as if it was all rather inevitable, and yet if we read more closely, we realize that the people to whom Moses was sent had a real hard time accepting what he was asking them to do, because even though they were enslaved, what they were used to was sort of safer, and they didn't want to make a change until they were pushed and pushed and pushed until they got to that point. And although it doesn't say that in Scripture, the Scripture scholars are fairly clear that, in fact, not all of them did leave. Some chose to leave, and it was a big, risky choice. And as Nancy said, they really were able to make that choice because they weren't single, isolated individuals. They were people who were able to sort of scream at each other and work it through and say, oh, well, okay, we have to go. This is obviously it, And so they went together. And in the other great sort of turning point of the history of the people of God, the history of the exile, when after a long time of oppression and corruption, the nation had really got to a point where it was ripe for invasion and got invaded, and a large proportion of the people were taken into exile, mostly the profession, what we'd now call the professional classes. And they settled down in Babylon, and on the whole, they did fairly well because they were not being oppressed as their ancestors had been. But then they had an opportunity to go back when there was a new king, Cyrus, who was a sensible man who realized that a land which had clever and energetic people in it was much more likely to pay him adequate taxes than one in which all the trained people had gone and the whole place was a wreck. So he said, you can go home if you want to, and in fact I'll finance you, I'll return all your old property and I'll give you some money to sort of start over. So it was a wonderful opportunity. But not all the people went back. It was a very difficult choice because it meant giving up maybe a little business that had been developed over nearly 3 generations by that time, a home, connections, friendships, familiarity. This was 70 years. It took a lot of courage to uproot and to go back to an abandoned land and a ruined city and start to rebuild. It was a big choice. It was the choice of coming home to God's land to make it once more truly the home of God and of God's people. So that's the kind of radical choice we're talking about, the choice for freedom and the choice of making home. Discipleship is both of those things. Discipleship is choosing freedom, which very often means stepping out of line. It means doing without the comforts which can come with fitting in with a system, even though you know it's unjust. But discipleship also means, in another sense, coming home. Coming home in the sense of reclaiming for God the land, the situation, the society which has lost sight of the vision. And again, you have to have a community to do it. It's a choice for a new kind of community. And the existence of that community is itself prophetic. In our time, or in any time, the pressure to fit in, not to make radical choices, is obviously enormous. And it comes under headings of loyalty, to one's family, to one's ethnic tradition, to one's country, to one's religion. Sometimes, in fact, to an extent, all of us have to fit in order to survive. At Wellspring, we've sort of lived with this dilemma in the way that we work with the women who come to our house, women and the men. On the one hand, if they're going to survive, if they're going to get homes, they need to get subsidies or they need to learn to get jobs, whatever. They've got to learn to work the system. They've got to learn what benefits they're entitled to, who to make a scene with if they don't get them. You know, all that sort of stuff. Very important if they're going to get anywhere. They've got to go into the system to get the right kind of training, to get the right kind of jobs, to learn how to present themselves, to learn to be acceptable. If they don't, they're not going to survive. And yet all the time you're doing that, you know that in a sense you're conniving at injustice, at a system that sets people obstacles to climb over and says, if you're going to be acceptable, you've got to do this and this and this, and you've got to be the kind of person we tell you you've got to be. So on the other hand, you want to be challenging the system. You want to be changing it. You want to be working with the other kinds of people who are also busy trying to challenge the system. And sometimes when you do that, you risk losing friends. We've got a wonderful board of directors at Wellspring. And being on the board of directors for some has been a long, slow, tough education. Because there are people who've come on the board because they've seen the kind of work that Wellspring does with poor people and helping them to get on their feet. And that says, that's wonderful, that's right, you know, we need to help these poor people on their way. But then when they come onto the board of directors or when they come into house as volunteers, there are all sorts of ways this happens, then they begin to hear a different kind of tune. One that says the system is wrong, not these people are inadequate, they've got to be taught to be adequate. But that they are being treated with injustice. And that's very hard for people to hear. People come because of their real human compassion for people who are suffering. And then they're asked to say, why are they suffering? Why is this happening to them? And so there begins a long journey in which they begin to make radical choices too. And we've seen some extraordinary changes, you can only call them conversions, among people because of that kind of exposure. It's really difficult. You can see it perhaps at its most simple. We help to operate a meal program, and we take our turns catering, and we in fact sort of inspired it in the beginning. And we go down there, and often people from the city go to help there because feeding the hungry is about as basic an act of compassion as you can imagine. So it naturally attracts people. But the next step is, why are so many people hungry? Now, after they've been there a while, it becomes more and more difficult to assume that these people are there because they're lazy, because they're sick, because they're no good. Now, a lot of them are very sick, mentally sick, and some of them are addicts. And there's a whole history behind that. But if you work there for any length of time, you cannot make those facile judgments anymore. And you have to say, isn't it extraordinary that in a nation which is the richest in the world, there are all these hungry people, even in this little city of Gloucester, where only half a mile away there are huge mansions with acres of beautiful gardens around them. And there are these people who come because that's the only time they're ever going to get a good meal. What's wrong? So those people are being asked to make very radical choices. First of all, choices in the way they think, and then going on from there, because you can't avoid it, choices in the way they live their lives. That's how it happens. But people need community to do that. To make an isolated choice is possible, but it usually comes out of a background of support and learning, education. But most of us need to be with others in order to be able to do that, to make the choice and to sustain it. The choice of discipleship is always lonely, but it's always a choice for community in some sense. As Nancy said a few minutes ago, one of the things that's always astonished us about Wellspring is the way it attracts people. Because we're not a particularly remarkable group of people. We've got different, some of us are, well, we've got all sorts of different gifts. We've all sorts of different backgrounds. It's something about the way we do things together and the kind of attitude that we have that people find tremendously attractive. And indeed, we wouldn't have survived and we wouldn't be able to do the work we do if it wasn't for that. Because people come and work as volunteers. As I said, they work on the board. And people give money. People get involved at all sorts of levels because they see there something that makes sense to them and they want to be part of it. And they become part of it, and by becoming part of it, they change it and it grows. They make choices. And so one of the things we've discovered, and this is the last thing I want to say this evening for both of us, the experience of working at prophetic spirituality in community is that you discover that these apparently rather weird choices, these different kinds of choices, are not different. I mean, they're different in a way, but they're normal. We live in a society which makes those kinds of radical choices seem very strange. What you need to learn when you work with other people who have made similar choices, or even are struggling with them, as we all do, that the values that we choose by making those choices are in fact normal in the eyes of God. They're normal in terms of what it is that can possibly make the world a right place for human beings. They're normal in terms of a world of justice and a world where there is enough. As Nancy said, if we look at the figures and the statistics for world production of food and the way land can be used, even with the vast population that we have, there is enough. To choose to make the radical choice of discipleship, to choose to live by the values of the gospel, is certainly to step out of line in one sense. But then it's to step into another kind of world, a community of people in which it is possible to say there's enough for everybody if we lived rightly, and in which it's possible to envisage justice for everybody and not to be crazy. To look at a world full of abundance and to say it can be a place for everyone in which everyone has enough. And that is the world which the prophets envisioned. It's the world which Jesus proclaimed as a possibility with such agony and such joy. It's a world which we celebrate when we come together, because although we're grieving, we're also people who celebrate. And that seems to me perhaps finally the best possible thing about making those radical choices, about the whole sense of prophetic spirituality. At a certain point, you know that you're in touch with reality. Thank you.